Right, look alive, Pippa. Let's do this. Today I wanted to talk about using mobility aids when you have an invisible illness. And like one of my previous videos, I'm trying to adapt some of my more popular blog posts into video format, but unlike one of the previous videos, I'm going to try and do this a bit more creatively than just looking down and reading off my iPad. So let's see how this one goes. So one of the very first posts I wrote and shared publicly was all about my experiences of beginning to use a wheelchair as somebody with an invisible illness. I wrote this post about 3 years ago now, and it's so strange to think back of. So I just thought we could have a chat really, because it's still a bit of a taboo area, and I'm sure I won't be the only one who's been through some of these experiences. So as I started the piece by saying, there's no ideal time to acquire a chronic illness, but becoming disabled halfway through your undergraduate degree has to be up there in the least ideal life situations list. Now, as somebody with an invisible illness, I think there were times where it was actually a blessing to look like other people around me and not have to identify as disabled straight away, not have it be the first thing that people see. But on the other hand, it also led to some really problematic encounters. Like others in my situation, I've experienced all the usual judgments, people telling me that I don't look ill, that I'm too young to need a seat on the bus, subtly implying that people like me are lazy. I've actually not had that one for a while. That used to be a really big thing in the chronic illness community, people pointing the finger and saying that people are lazy. Obviously, as somebody with an invisible illness, prior to using mobility aids myself, I was prepared for these comments because sadly people have experienced them for years and years and years. But there was a part of me that thought that once I began using mobility aids, which in my case was a wheelchair, I kind of thought some of that stigma would go away. I thought I would face fewer comments like this. But what I actually found was that when I first started using a wheelchair, the kind of issue seemed to be that even though I was sat in this wheelchair, I still had an invisible condition. So I was using this visible mobility aid, but people couldn't tell just from looking at me what was wrong with me. And that meant that some of these judgments were still there. I'm going to read the next bit because I think I'll do it better than trying to explain it. So I put, during my first trips out of the house with George, which was the name of the wheelchair because you always have to name the wheelchair, I was hyper aware of the people around me. I felt people's gazes on me as they slowly looked me up and down as if trying to identify my ailment. And I felt their shock and disbelief as I crossed my legs and they realised that no, I wasn't paralysed. The thing that really baffled them though, and continues to baffle people today, was when I stood up from my wheelchair to transfer to a seat. And the impulse to make light of it and exclaim, "I'm healed, it's a miracle," tempts me every single time. Still does, to be honest, it's really bad. So for me, kind of finding humour in these instances was a coping mechanism, because sometimes the only way to deal with stuff like this is to laugh about it, because if you didn't laugh, you'd cry, to be honest. But as I go on to say in the blog post, this actually led to some problematic encounters in itself, so I'll read the next one again because I won't do it justice. I recall one situation where I was viewing flats with a letting agent and my parents. I'd stood and talked for a few moments without my wheelchair and without mentioning my disability, but then climbed in my wheelchair that my dad had brought around, ready to view a property. Afterwards, I found out that the letting agent had been utterly taken by surprise by the wheelchair because, and I quote, "because I seemed so cheerful." They couldn't get their head around the fact that I was silently suffering because I talked and laughed and smiled like any other person. Another time, my best friend and I were out shopping and laughing our heads off about something or other as she wheeled me around a gift shop. The shop owner took this moment to approach us and exclaim loudly, "What happened to you then?" Now, this is a question that I still get a lot, and again, I think it's because I have an invisible illness. I use a wheelchair, but people can't tell what's wrong with me, so for some reason or other, they think it's okay to ask. And as I put in the blog post, I think sometimes people just expect a funny story. So I don't look ill, so people expect a drunken fall on a crazy night out, or maybe some sort of temporary water skiing accident. And even today, this was 3 years ago and this still rings true, I still haven't found a way to answer this question in a non-awkward way. Because when someone says, "Oh, what's wrong with you then?" I don't know what to say other than long-term illness, And obviously that's just not ideal for anybody involved. There's no I know people online and I wish I had the guts to do this in real life. I have friends who, when they are asked the question, "What's wrong with you then?" they say things like, "Oh, a shark attack." And I just think that's brilliant, and I really, really wish I had the courage to do that. And maybe I will one day, because maybe it will teach people a lesson. But like I say, I don't think it comes from a bad place all the time. Like, I think a lot of the times people are just curious. Yeah, so like I don't want to make anyone feel bad, but like at the same time, like how do you kind of even get around that issue? Oh yeah, so I put kind of like, I replied, haha, long-term illness, with a polite little laugh, and they looked like they wanted the ground to swallow them whole, the shopkeeper that is. Well, they replied, gingerly patting my arm and trying to salvage the situation. At least you're still smiling. So the thing I kind of concluded is that even when visible mobility aids are added into the equation, if you have an invisible condition, the sad truth is that people are still inclined to kind of doubt your condition if they can't see it with their own eyes. And that's something I've found consistently over the past 2 years. And the other thing that I kind of concluded in this particular piece is that if you don't appear to be miserable and suffering, people are inclined to doubt your condition. And I personally now think that's very telling of the way that people perceive disability and illness. Like there's this binary of either being like one of these cheerful, inspirational people or being miserable and suffering, when in reality, we're all in the middle really. Like nobody is one or the other. Like they just aren't. We're still human at the end of the day. So this is how I concluded the piece. I said, I hope with everything in me that one day those with chronic illnesses, including those without mobility aids, will be able to sit in reserved disabled seats or move their legs in their wheelchair or, God forbid, laugh and enjoy their life without the judgment of others. But for now, we need to do all we can to help the healthy population to understand. Just because somebody doesn't appear to be ill, it doesn't mean they're not suffering. I'm reading, like I said, this was one of the first blog posts I wrote, and I'm reading it back now, and there's so much that I would change about the structure and the way that I wrote it, but that's not really the issue here. I don't know why I'm telling you that. So yeah, using a mobility aid when you have an invisible illness, like it's not as straightforward as you might think it is, and even though in a sense, maybe it should reduce some of the stigma that people experience, because the way that we've been taught to internalise disability and perceive disability is as somebody who uses mobility aids like a wheelchair. Like that's the stereotypical image that the word disability kind of paints in the minds of people who don't have much experience with it. So it's a tricky one, because yes, people with invisible illnesses face this stigma, but then people who use mobility aids also face this stigma. And even people who don't have invisible conditions also face stigma. Like there is no way of getting away from the stigma until we start challenging perceptions of people's understandings of what it means to be disabled. That was a lot of words that didn't really make much sense then, was it? Let's try that again. I think the only way to really move forward in the long run is to challenge people's perceptions of what it means to be disabled, and that there isn't like a one-size-fits-all approach to disability. There isn't like one representative image of what disability looks like. And even though we are making progress, I do still think there's a really long way to go. Actually, one thing that I do kind of want to tack on to the end of this is the fact that we do have certain schemes in place for kind of making invisible conditions more visible. So in the time since I wrote this post, actually, we've got things like the Please Offer Me a Seat card that Transport for London did. We have the Sunflower Lanyard scheme, which people can use in public places, where you wear this to indicate that you might have a condition that's less visible or you might need some particular help. And like everything, there are pros and cons to these things, I think. Like, I think it's great that they exist, and if it's something that helps the non-disabled public to recognise that somebody might be experiencing these things, I think that's really positive. But it does always depend on the empathy of the non-disabled public. You're always going to get people who aren't on board with it. I'd like to believe the majority of people are allies and they'll do what they can to support you, but the unfortunate reality is that there are going to be people who aren't on board with it. And that's something I personally experienced. It would have been about this time last year, actually. Like, I have the Please Offer Me a Seat card. I was on a packed train. I didn't have my mobility aids on this occasion. So I got my card out because it was a packed train. I can't stand up for long periods of time because I drop. And I went to the person in the priority seats. It was a family, and I showed them the card and I said, I'm really sorry, I need to sit down. And they just weren't having it. Like, maybe I should have pushed harder, but I felt really awkward anyway. Yeah, they just didn't move. So I had to sit on the dirty train floor because they didn't deem me worthy of their priority seats. And even though I had the card, maybe it's because I had an invisible illness. I'll leave that blog post link below. Like I say, it's probably not one of my best, but it was one of my first ones that I wrote about my chronic illness. If you have had any experiences like that, do tell me about them. I know they're not nice to talk about, but it is important to talk about them. And yeah, right, okay, no, we'll leave it there, otherwise I'm just going to ramble. So thank you so much as always for watching. You can subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time.